This is the first video in this series, simplifying complex and conceptual ideas in teaching and learning. And in this video, we are going to see a phenomenon called the gap between the minds and its importance in teaching and learning. Before we move on to the topic, let us acknowledge the source of information and the contribution made by the illustrator. Right. Let us start with the hypothesis. When we teach, we try to communicate information and knowledge to the students. But how do we know how well the students comprehend the information and knowledge we teach? The challenge for the teachers at any level, from kindergarten to the university professor, is how to get the knowledge out of their own heads and pass into someone else, and how to know it has reached there. Before we start understanding this, we need to be aware of a complex phenomenon that happens in the minds of the teachers as they grow with expertise. And this phenomenon creates a paradox that every teacher faces at the heart of their teaching and learning practice. What is this paradox? From the source I quote, on the one hand, the more expert you are, the more knowledge you have to offer a novice. On the other hand, the more expert you are, the less like a novice you have become, unquote. Now it creates an effect that the expert become less accustomed to know how a novice experience their learning. And this gap between the novice and the expert is what is called the gap between the minds. So what is the solution? Well, many may assume it is a deadlock and no progression is possible. In reality, however, the onus is on the teacher to find the way out. Now, what will be the impact if the teacher is not cognizant of this gap and could not take measures? Then the effectiveness of the teaching will be at stake. Now, let us try to understand this concept from this illustration. Let us say the professor here is having huge experience in the field of aeronautics engineering. He has published several papers. Now, he has to teach this subject to a beginner. Both of them are at different levels of knowledge. The expert professor is at the level of knowledge of making actual aircraft. However, the novice is at the level of making only paper planes. Now, placing the experts, the expert, his knowledge is somewhere here and the novice knowledge is somewhere here. And the gap between the expert and the novice mind is what the psychologists called the gap between the minds. Let us try to illustrate this with a life example. When we start learning to ride a bike, at the initial stage, we need a lot of scaffolding. When we move on to the hands-off stage, and with time, one fine morning we become independent, and with lots of practice, we become expert. Let us look at a scenario here that this expert has a chance to teach someone. Very commonly, we hear this trainer expert informing the novice who just started the training, saying, just focus, it is very easy. Why the trainer says such things? This is because the expert trainer is not a novice anymore. They cannot fully perceive how a novice experienced their learning at that moment. The novice would be feeling anxious about falling at that moment. Moving on to the implications. As a teacher, it is important, first of all, to acknowledge what is known as the gap between the minds. Then, whenever we teach a new subject or a topic or to a new set of students, being always aware of the gap between what we know and what our students know in that subject. And more importantly, to take appropriate steps to bridge that gap. What are these appropriate steps? This may range from providing multiple means of representation of knowledge to the students under the guidelines of universal design for learning to the use of various active learning strategies. We are not going into that now. This is a separate domain in the area of teaching and learning. Now, as the parents or teachers at various developmental stages of their kids, understanding this principle will help in right parenting. It prevents parents placing an unrealistic expectation on their kids. And it also helps parents avoiding comparing their kids among their siblings and also with their friends and classmates. Now, students who might be watching this content may reflect and say, oh, this is the responsibility of the teacher. Of course, the onus is on the teacher, but learners could also derive some important lessons from this. Let's say, when the teacher is explaining some complex aspect in a subject, one should not pretend to understand something you do not. One needs to embrace the truth that you are not able to comprehend something, and it needs to be informed to the teacher to get it clarified before you proceed to the next step of the learning. More importantly, seek to learn from someone other than the teacher, because teachers are not the only source of knowledge. Seeking instruction from your fellow classmate is the best available alternative. Since you and your teacher, since you and your fellow classmate are at the level of same knowledge, then the gap between the minds is expected to be narrow. If that is the case, it is highly likely that you may get a better understanding from your peers' explanation than from your usual expert teacher. Before we end, lastly, through years of research in educational psychology, these factors are identified as the main ones that contribute to the development of this phenomenon called gap between the minds. It is very important that teachers and students should be aware of these factors. We will see these factors one by one in brief in the future videos to come. Thank you.